what actually happened in the early days of the war. Starting in 2020 and 2021, Vladimir Putin and the Russian government in general started talking about the Ukrainians as not really existing, that they were a made-up ethnicity designed by the Nazis or by the Americans simply to put a thorn in Russia's side. And as such, it was Russia's manifest destiny to reclaim lands that were once it. And as the time went on, the number of territories that were traditional Russian territory, according to this propaganda, expanded to include most of the countries that have joined NATO since 1992. And then by the time we got to December of 2021, the Russians started moving tens of thousands of troops onto Ukraine's borders. And by the time we got to January and early February, we had over 100,000. By the time we got to February 22nd, the day that troops crossed the border, we were at probably about 130,000. On the 22nd, over 70,000 troops crossed from the Russian territories into the occupied Ukrainian territories. And we all of a sudden had a mass mobilization in Belarus as well. And then on the 24th, forces crossed from Belarus south and from those occupied territories in the east further west into Ukraine proper. And never forget that this is not the first war between Russia and Ukraine since 1992. In 2014, the Russians flat out invaded the Donbas territory in the east and also captured Crimea in the south. So anytime somebody tells you that this war is someone's fault other than Russia, you can tell them to go screw themselves because you're smarter than that. Finally, and probably the most depressing question of them all, how long could this war last? I mean, no war lasts forever, does it? Let me give you the dark answer, the really dark answer, and then the truly dark answer. So first, the dark answer. This, at the moment, is an issue of mobilization and ammo. The Russian military support system, the military-industrial complex, is clearly not doing well. So much money has been stolen from the system that it's difficult for the Russians to get stuff to the front, and their internal logistical system is trapped. So between not having as much as they thought they did, between the government being fleeced blind by their own defense minister, Ukrainians interfering with transport systems via drones and sabotage and artillery strikes, and general status of disarray of the Russian transport infrastructure, it's an open question how long the Russians can go with this. Now, they do have 70 years of reserves, and whenever we see a 1940s or 50s tank brought out, we're like, ha ha ha, look, they're pulling their old shit out. Well, a couple things there. Number one, they have shit to pull out. The Ukrainians don't. And second, we're seeing this old stuff come out because some of their newer stuff just takes longer to refurbish. If you have a pre-optics tank, getting that back into condition just requires some refurbishment, some more tubing, maybe running some fresh oil in it, and you're good to go. If you've got 1970s and 80s styles optics, you need to now replace those. And that means a much more expensive and lengthy overhaul. You may get a better tank out of it on the back end, but it does take more time and money. So they're bringing out their old stuff first. They still have several million more armored vehicles that they can throw into this. Now, it's a limited quantity, yes, but Ukraine is basically limited now to what it captures from the Russians and what the West sends, which brings us to the second point.
The Ukrainian counteroffensive has begun, so I'm going to give you an idea of what's going on and why. Ukrainian forces have crossed en masse the river, probably closer to Dnipro, which is in central Ukraine, gone down the southern eastern side, if you will, of the Dnieper River, and are attacking into the province of Zaporizhzhia on a wide bank. It appears that they're doing a lot of probing actions, hitting the front in multiple places, looking for a place that's weaker that they can then achieve breakthrough. The goal here is to break through the troops and not necessarily do any encircling actions, but drive straight south to the Sea of Azov. If they can do that, they will have severed the land bridge through Ukraine proper, from Russia proper, over into the northern access point for Crimea, and basically split the front in two. If they can do that, the Russian position in the Crimean Peninsula becomes completely untenable, because the Ukrainians will then be able to, using their own weapons, not even Western weapons, will be able to take out the rest of the Kerch Strait Bridge. Now, if you remember last year, Kerch, the rail bridge was basically destroyed, but they can still move things on the remaining one span of the road bridge, and that's how they're trucking in all their supplies for Crimea through the eastern supply route. If that is severed, then Crimea is on its own. It can't grow its own food. It can't supply its own energy, and then forces from Ukraine will be in too close of proximity for the Russians to even have ships coming and going on a regular basis. So the whole, what used to be a platform for Russian strategy through the centuries, would become a massive embarrassment and a strategic embroglio Leo, because they just couldn't supply their own people. That is proceeding apace. It looks like the Russians are holding, at least for the moment. There hasn't been a breakthrough that I've been able to detect. What's going to prove critical is the degree to which the conscripts have been pushed into this front by the Russians. As a rule, the Russians use conscripts as reinforcements, which they don't do very good at, and as human wave attacks, as cannon fodder, in which they're pretty decent. I mean, they're disposable from the Russian point of view, but if you use them to hold a position, a defensive position, then they're very likely to break and run. We have not seen that in the 72 hours since the offensives got going. It's too soon to know, but honestly, there's not a lot of good information coming out of there. The Russians obviously don't have reporters embedded with them, and the Ukrainians have chosen not to for operational security. So we're not going to know one way or another on this for a few more days, probably.
Is if you look at history, the Russian wars are very rarely quick. Everyone thinks of World War I and World War II, which only lasted a few years, as being how wars are fought. And that has been how it is in the industrial age. But if the Russians, and to a lesser degree the Ukrainians, can't maintain an industrial level of output, and this becomes more of a long-term slug match, the Russians have been expanding bit by bit over the last 4 centuries. And various groups that they have occupied refer to things like the Russian encroachment as the 200 Years' War. Ukraine wasn't captured in one lightning conflict. It was captured in a series of conflicts over a century. The same is true for most of Russia's frontiers. It ebbs and flows and ebbs and flows. Remember, the Russians here are trying to seek a more defensible perimeter, and that means going through all of the flat, open territories that are near them, and all of Ukraine is open and flat. So history tells us that this is less a discrete conflict and more just the normal status of what it's like to be on the Russian borderlands. Ukraine has among the world's worst demographics. You generally have kids when you feel positive about your future, and there hasn't been a lot to be positive about in Ukraine for the last 25 years, and especially since the Russians invaded the Donbass and Crimea in 2014. It has one of the world's lowest birth rates and is an extraordinarily distorted demographic structure, with fewer people in their 40s than their 30s and their 20s than their teens than children. And that was before the war. We now have at any given time at least 1 million, probably closer to 3 million, Ukrainian men involved in the military conflict or training. And in addition, 1/3 of the population of Ukraine pre-war, so almost 15 million people, are internally displaced or refugees.
One of the things that Ukrainians are trying to do here, beyond getting their land back, is try to convince to the international community that the Russians are the losing horse, and so there's no reason to back them. And there's a lot of countries in the developing world who are hedging their bets. Hard to blame them. But if the Ukrainians can show that the war is clearly going the other way, and get people like Xi Jinping of China to blink, and make it so that the only people that are still backing the Russians are folks like Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua or Tucker Carlson, then we're in a very different public relations fight here. I still don't think that would make the Russians stop, but getting more and more countries on the other side is something that would allow Ukraine to more easily unlock aid and military support from the world over.